Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to If Deku had Venom Part 3. Last time on the What If, the USJ attack happened, and during the attack, Izuku fought the main leader of the attack, Shigaraki, and the monster he was able to control, which was Nomu. But during the attack, Izuku got knocked out cold, but in response, Venom took control of Izuku's body. But even with that, Izuku was able to survive the attack along with the rest of the class. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so it begins with What If days after the last part ended, because UA gave Class 1A time to rest up and recover from the experience. And while the break was going on, Izuku was talking to Venom about what had happened during the attack, and why he was able to take control of him. And in response, Venom told Izuku that he can only take control of his body if Izuku is weak, or his hunger is way too strong for Izuku to control. So he has nothing to truly worry about unless either of those two things come to pass. Then when Izuku wasn't talking to Venom, he would train using Venom to see how to use it more efficiently, with him increasing the strength of the webbing he shoots out. So now we skip to when Class 1A starts school again, and when the school day begins, the class was wondering who would teach them, because Aizawa got so injured in the attack he was sent to the hospital. But once the bell rang, Aizawa walked into the room with him being completely wrapped up in bandages. And seeing him, the class began to question him, asking him should he really be teaching? And in response, he just said he was fine. But then he told them that he actually has important information that he needs to tell them, which was they will be having the sports festival in a couple weeks. And hearing this, the class was hesitant about whether they should even have the sports festival in the first place, because they were just attacked a couple days ago. And hearing this, Aizawa rebutted by saying the sports festival is the most watched event of the year, and that if they don't have the festival, they will be sending out a message that UA could be stopped after one measly attack. And hearing this, the class decided that there wasn't any more use arguing anymore. Okay, so now we skip after school, and Izuku was in a nearby forest so he could train. And when he was there, he and Venom began to have a conversation about what they should do in order to get stronger. And after some thinking, Izuku remembered what had happened during the attack, a couple days ago. And he remembered that apparently he had grown fangs and sharp claws while Venom was in control of his body. And remembering that, Izuku asked Venom how was he able to change his body. And hearing this, Venom told Izuku that because he's a symbiote, he can change how he wants to look, and he can create matter to a limited extent. And hearing this, Izuku began to cover himself in Venom, and he stuck out one of his arms and he began to focus. Then after a couple seconds, a small tendril popped out of his forearm, and it began to wiggle around. And with a bit of concentration, Izuku was able to move it around to his will. Then after a minute, Izuku got tired, so the tendril went back into the rest of the Venom suit. Then Izuku decided that that was what he wanted to focus on. So now we skip to the day of the festival, and by this point, Izuku has grown better at controlling the symbiote to make tendrils. So at the same time, he can make two tendrils that are the size of two of his arms, and he can control them at the same time. And with that, Izuku can use them both offensively and defensively. But the downside is that it takes a lot of energy and concentration, so Izuku can only use his tendrils consistently for a span of 5 minutes before he has to stop. Okay, so now we skip to the day of the festival, and currently Class 1A is hanging out in the waiting room, waiting for the event to actually start. And because Izuku has a quirk that includes super strength as one of his abilities, Todoroki walked up to Izuku and he told him that he would defeat him, so he can prove to a certain someone that he doesn't need his fire side to be strong. But before Izuku could respond, the festival starts, so Ida told everyone to walk into the stadium. And when everyone was there, Midnight, who was their main examiner, told them that they will be doing an obstacle race. And when she was done explaining the rules, everyone lined up in front of a big hallway. And once Izuku got into the line, Izuku covered himself in the Venom symbiote. And once Izuku got covered, the race began. And once it began, instead of Izuku running, Izuku shot out a web aimed at the roof of the hallway, which brought him high into the air. And once he was in the air, he began to shoot out webs, and he began to swing to the other side of the hallway. And because there was nothing blocking his path, Izuku was able to get somewhere in the middle of the group. And seeing that he needed to catch up to Izuku, Todoroki froze the ground under himself and the rest of the hallway, which stuck many of the racers in place. And because of that, he was able to somewhat keep up with Izuku. And by the time Izuku got to the other side of the hallway, he was in the top 5, with Bakugo being around the same place as Todoroki and Izuku, and Todoroki being right behind Izuku. And seeing this, Izuku ran as fast as he could with the other people that were also able to make it past Todoroki's ice. But after a couple minutes, he and the other runners started to get surrounded by robots from the entrance exams. And seeing this, Izuku shot out a web at the robot that was right in front of him, and when it stuck, Izuku would pull on the robot, making the robot go flying towards him. And when it got to Izuku would punch the robot in the head, which was just strong enough to break the robot and make the robot's head go flying clean off. But while Izuku was distracted trying to destroy the robots, Todoroki was able to keep running, making him get to first place. Then once Izuku was done destroying the robots, he kept running. And after a couple minutes of this, the group came across multiple zero-pointers, which blocked their way. And seeing this, Izuku stopped to think of what he should do next. But before he was able to come up with a plan, Todoroki ran under a zero-pointer and he froze in place while it was off balance, making the robot fall to the ground, crushing 2 people, with them being Kirishima and Tetsu. Then once the tube broke through the robot, Bakugo flew over the robot's body with some other people following his lead. And seeing this, Izuku shot out a web which stuck to the top of the robot and he used it to fling himself into the air. Then when Izuku got to the top of the robot, Izuku saw that Bakugo was able to get to Todoroki. And once Bakugo was able to get to Todoroki, the two began a fight while still running. And seeing that he needed to catch up, Izuku jumped down from the giant robot, and once he landed, he ran as fast as he could towards the two. But even though the two were slowed down because they were fighting each other while running, Izuku still wasn't able to catch up completely, even though he is a close third, even after a couple minutes. But eventually the three and the other runners that were able to keep up with them found themselves at a ravine. And seeing this, Bakugo flew over it, while Todoroki used his ice quirk to slide on a rope that led to the other side. And seeing this, Izuku immediately jumped down into the ravine, and he began to swing as fast as he could, using his fall as momentum. And what he stuck his webs to were the randomly spread out pieces of land that were in the ravine. And once Izuku got to the other side, he ran up the side of the wall, and by the time he got to the surface, both Bakugo and Todoroki were a couple feet in front of him. And seeing this, Izuku ran closely behind the two. Then after a couple minutes of running, the three find themselves at a minefield. And seeing this, Bakugo flew over the mines while Todoroki used his quirk on the ground while he ran, making it so the mines don't go off. And seeing this, Izuku began to think about what he should do, because if the explosions go off, he's doomed, because even if they are weak explosions, any explosion would impact him by a lot, because that's Venom's main weakness. Then eventually, Izuku was able to figure out something that would allow him to catch up to his classmates. So Izuku began to focus, and after a couple seconds, two black tendrils that are double his arm length began to sprout out of his back. Then once they were formed, he began to move using his tendrils for mobility. And once he placed the tendrils on the ground, he would make them go splat into an X shape, because the mines are lined up in rows and columns. And because they're in an X shape, it will allow Izuku to place his tendrils because there would be room for him to move. And seeing that he needed to hurry because he had a limited time he could focus and control his tendrils, Izuku began to sprint using his tendrils. Then after a couple minutes, Izuku was able to catch up to Bakugo and Todoroki, and eventually the three began to come across the end of the minefield in about a minute. And seeing this, Izuku knew that he needed to do something to make it so he would come in first place. And seeing this, Izuku began to sink. Then after a couple seconds, Izuku used his tendrils to jump as high as he could into the air, which was around 20 feet. Then while Izuku was in the air, Izuku began to shoot out webs. But the way Izuku shot them out was like small blasts of webs. So he separated himself from the webs the second they shot out. And he aimed them at the mines in front of Bakugo and Todoroki. And with the power of around 10 mines, both Bakugo and Todoroki got launched back a bit, with Bakugo getting launched farther because he was in the air. But before he fell, Bakugo was able to regain his balance, allowing him to keep flying. And Todoroki landed on his ice path, so he's fine. Then before Izuku landed, Izuku shot out webbing to the pieces of land that were mindless. Then he used that webbing to make him land in that piece of land. But once Izuku landed, Bakugo and Todoroki were able to recover, so they began to run towards Izuku again. But seeing this, Izuku began to run with the power of his tendrils. Then after around 30 seconds, Izuku was finally able to get to the end of the mines. So he returned the tendrils back into his suit, and he began to run normally. So it became a sprint to the arena, and after a minute, the three were able to get to the stadium with Izuku getting first place, Todoroki getting second, and Bakugo getting third. So now we skip to when everyone was able to make it back, the arena. And when they did, they were told that they will be doing a cavalry battle. Then on a giant screen in front of them, Midnight showed the participants the headbands they have. And because Izuku got first place in the race, he got the 10 million point headband. And after that, they were given 15 minutes to fight on a team. But again, because Izuku had the 10 million point headband, no one wanted to team up with him. But luckily, he was able to find Ida and Ochako, and he asked them to join him. And hearing this, Ochako accepted his invite. But however, for Ida didn't want to stay in Izuku's shadow. So he told Izuku that Todoroki isn't the only person that wants to defeat him. Then once he was done saying that, Ida turned and walked away, and he joined Team Todoroki. And seeing that he needed to find more teammates, Izuku and Ochako began to look around. And right before the timer ran out, Izuku and Ochako were able to find the amount of people that they needed. And they were able to create the same team as in the canon. So when the time was up, everyone put on their headbands. And when they were ready, the challenge began. And when it did, Team Izuku tried their best to stay out of fighting anyone that seemed to be too much of a challenge for them. Because since they have the 10 million point headband, they decided that it would be better to play a mostly defensive battle, because they already have enough points to pass. But they still got some points from other headbands as a just in case from other people that tried to attack them. So after a couple minutes, they had a couple headbands from other people. But before they were able to get any more headbands, Team Todoroki appeared and they tried to attack. And they tried to attack with a nice attack. And in response, Izuku told his teammates to hold on tight. And once they did, Izuku shot out 2 tendrils which were long enough to hit the ground. Then once they hit the ground, Izuku used them to push him and his teammates out of the way, just in time, to the left side of Todoroki and his team. Because when they were on his left, Todoroki wouldn't be able to hit them with his quirk without hitting Ida. And they tried to play a defensive strategy. But after a couple minutes, Ida decided that he needed to go all out, so he told his teammates to hold on. Then after a couple seconds, Ida's engines began to shoot out flames, with some becoming eventually bright blue. Then once he was ready, Ida shouted Cipro burst. Then before Izuku and his teammates were able to react, Todoroki and his team appeared in front of Izuku, and they were able to grab the 10 million point headband. Then once they grabbed it, they kept on going, with some appearing a few feet behind Izuku. And seeing this, Izuku knew that he needed to grab back the headband, because for the whole event they were playing mostly defensive, so they didn't have enough points to pass to the next event, even with all the headbands they were able to grab from the other teams. So Team Izuku began to run a Team Todoroki, and while they were running, Todoroki fired ice attack after ice attack, which they were able to dodge with the help of Izuku's tendrils. And after some time, Team Izuku was able to get to Team Todoroki, and once they were able to get right in front of them, Izuku shot out a web, which hit one of Todoroki's headbands, which he believed was a 10 million point headband. Then once it was stuck, Izuku pulled on the web as hard as he could, which ripped a headband straight off of Todoroki's neck. Then once the headband was freed, Izuku grabbed it. But once he was in his hands, Izuku noticed that it wasn't the 10 million point headband, and instead it was a headband with a different amount. But even with this new headband, they still didn't have enough points to pass. So Izuku knew that he needed to go in for another headband. So Team Izuku began to run at Team Todoroki again, while there were only a couple seconds remaining, and they were able to get close to Team Todoroki. But before Izuku could get to Todoroki's headbands, the time ended. And when it did, Izuku began to apologize to his team for not being able to get them enough points. But while he was apologizing, Tokoyami told him to look at the leaderboard. And when he did, he saw that somehow they got enough points to pass. And when Izuku looked back, he saw that Tokoyami was holding onto a new headband, which he was just able to get off Todoroki while he wasn't paying attention at the last second, making it so Team Izuku was able to go into the next round. And after this, the students had a lunch break. And because Izuku doesn't have one for all, Todoroki doesn't have his conversation with Izuku. So instead, Izuku just has some chocolate in order to replenish and keep Venom at bay. So now we skip to when lunch is over, and when all the first years were able to get back to the middle of the stadium, Midnight told them the next phase of the festival, which are 1v1s. And after the names of the matchups were revealed, Ojiro and someone from Class 1B forfeited, because they both feel like they don't deserve it. Then after they changed the names for the first rounds, the students in the first match went to the prep rooms to prepare themselves for the match, which were Izuku and Shinso, while the rest of the students went to the bleachers to watch. And while Izuku was preparing, Ojiro walked into the room, and he began to tell Izuku about Shinso, and what his quirk seemed to be. And by the time Ojiro was done talking, the match was about to begin. So Izuku then began to walk to the stadium while Ojiro went to the bleachers. And when both Shinso and Izuku got to the battle arena in the stadium, Midnight began to count down, and when she got to 0, the match began. And when it did, Izuku covered himself in Venom. And in his mind, Izuku told Venom to keep his mouth closed no matter how much he wanted to open it. And hearing this, Venom obliged. So Izuku's jaw got locked. Then once Izuku's jaw was locked, Izuku ran towards Shinso and the two began to fight, with Izuku having the upper hand because of his super strength and senses. Then after a couple punches, Izuku decided to end the match quickly. So Izuku shot out 2 webs that stuck Shinso's arms in place. Then when Shinso was binded, Izuku shot out a web and he swung him around. Then after a couple of swings, Izuku let go, making Shinso get launched. And when Shinso hit the ground a couple feet later, he was outside of the arena. And when Shinso hit the ground, Izuku was labeled the winner of the match. And Izuku didn't have to worry about any of the damage that was done to him because of Shinso, because of Venom's healing capabilities. And also because Shinso didn't do that much damage. But on his way to the bleachers from the arena, he runs into Endeavor, who tells him that he has an interesting quirk with a lot of potential, with the main one being he's weak to flames and heat, which could be a challenge for Todoroki unless he decides to use his other side, which would make him more like himself. And hearing this, Izuku turned to walk away. And while his back was turned, Izuku told Endeavor that Todoroki wasn't him, and he told him that he wouldn't be a pawn in the game that Endeavor was playing. Then once Izuku said that, he began to walk away to go to the bleachers. But while he was walking, he began to question why did Todoroki not use his fire side. Okay, so now we skipped when the match between Todoroki and Izuku was about to begin. And when the fight began, Izuku began to fight by covering himself in Venom. Then once Izuku was covered, Izuku began to run towards Todoroki. But before he was able to get to Todoroki, Todoroki fired a ice attack that was even taller than Izuku. And seeing this, Izuku quickly shot out a web to the side of himself, hitting the wall of the arena. And when it made contact, Izuku pulled and retracted the webbing. And with that, he was barely able to dodge a wave of ice. Then once that one attack didn't work, Todoroki began to fire ice attack after ice attack, with them all being fast, but they're just as tall as Izuku. And with the help of his super sense, Izuku was able to jump over the attacks just in time. And after a couple ice attacks, Izuku was confused, wondering why was Todoroki going slow after every attack. And being confused, Izuku began to scan Todoroki to see what he was doing. Then when he was actually looking at Todoroki, he saw that ice was starting to form on Todoroki's side, and that he was trembling. And seeing this, Izuku stopped in his tracks, and he asked him why was he holding back on them. And in response, Todoroki told him to shut up and fight him. And he then launched an ice attack at Izuku, but in response, Izuku did nothing, and he waited for the ice to come to him. Then at the very last second, a tendril came out of Izuku's back, and it slashed at the base of the ice, stopping the ice in its tracks. Then after that ice attack, Izuku was able to get a clear shot of Todoroki, so he shot out a web, which hit Todoroki in the chest. Then before Todoroki was able to react, Izuku grabbed the web and he tried his best to swing Todoroki, and he threw him as hard as he could, which made Todoroki get flung a couple feet. And he would have been thrown out of the arena, but before Todoroki hit the outside, Todoroki was able to tap the floor of the arena with his foot. And with that tap, tap, Todoroki was able to make an ice wall behind him, creating a barrier to the outside of the arena, which allowed Todoroki to stay inside the arena. Then once Todoroki got up, Izuku told him that he wouldn't be able to beat him if he didn't go all out and use his fire side. And hearing this, Todoroki asked him did his father tell him to say this, but in response Izuku just shook his head, and he told him that he doesn't care what his father told him, but what he does care about is that he's not actually trying, because everyone else in this event has participated, trying their best to show the world what they had. And Todoroki not even trying would just disgrace them. Then after some arguing, Izuku shouted that it was his power, not his. And hearing this, Todoroki began to think about everything. And after a couple seconds, Todoroki's right side got engulfed in flames. And seeing this, Venom was shouting in Izuku's head, asking him why did he do that, and that they would have won if he did not agitate the target, and make them stronger. Then after some more yelling inside Izuku's head, he asked him why did he do this. And Izuku in Izuku's mind told Venom that's what heroes do. They save people and go all out. And if he didn't do this, then Todoroki would have lost the way. And hearing this, Venom began to ponder, but after a couple seconds he just sighed and he told Izuku fine, but just don't get them killed, and to be careful of the flames. Then once Venom said this, Todoroki asked why was Izuku just standing there, and he asked had he already given up after such a long speech. But hearing this, Izuku just shook his head and he walked over to the other side of the arena. And when the two were ready, the two went for one final clash, with Todoroki launching the biggest ice attack he could muster, which was way too big for Izuku to just move out of the way. So Izuku then jumped out of the arena with the strongest jump he could make. Then he shot out a web which was just long enough to hit the ceiling of the stadium. And because Izuku hasn't technically touched the outside of the arena, he was still inside and he hasn't broken the rules. Then once the webbing hit, Izuku retracted and he pulled on the web, which flung Izuku high into the air, which was just high enough so Izuku was able to get over the giant ice attack. Then once Izuku was over the ice, Izuku was in a free fall, with him being over Todoroki and a couple feet to the side. Then once Izuku was close enough after a couple seconds, Izuku shot out two webs from his hands, both on each side of Todoroki. Then when they landed, Izuku pulled and retracted them, making it so he began to fall towards Todoroki at a fast speed, and he was going in for a kick, which would have been powerful enough to knock Todoroki out of the arena. But as a counterattack, Todoroki lifted his other hand, and he launched a giant fire attack aimed directly at Izuku. And seeing this, Izuku knew that he needed to go all out, so he began to stick his arms out, and he shot out his tendrils in front of him, and he used them as a sort of shield. But the second the flames hit, Izuku and Venom got hit with intense pain, with the suit reacting with it losing its form and it began to lose control, with it beginning to wriggle around. And after a couple seconds, the tendrils completely dried out and dissipated, so it began to hit the two head on. But even with the pain, Izuku and Venom focused in order to try to hold up. But before Izuku even got close to hitting the ground, Izuku and Venom lost energy, so Venom fell off of Izuku, making Izuku hit Todoroki in his normal form. And once Izuku hit Todoroki, the match was over, so Todoroki got flung out of the arena, hitting the floor. And because of the fire Todoroki just fired, the arena got filled with smoke. So once the arena got cleared of smoke, the stadium saw that Todoroki was on the floor outside the arena. And seeing this, they looked towards Izuku and they were about to declare him the winner. But when they looked at Izuku, they saw Izuku was unconscious with a puddle of venom right next to him. But even worse, because of the force of the kick, Izuku's legs were broken. And because it was obvious that Izuku wouldn't be able to participate in the future matches, Todoroki was declared the winner by default. Then once the match was over, people were sent with stretchers to get Izuku. Then once Izuku was on a stretcher, the small puddle of venom jumped onto Izuku, and the two were dragged away to Recover Girl's office. And while Izuku was getting healed, the rest of the matches took place, with the results being the exact same for every match. So now we skipped to when Class 1A was back into the classroom after the festival was over. And when he was sure everyone was back, Aizawa announced that they will have the next 2 days off to relax. Okay, so now we skip to when those 2 days were over. And when class began, Aizawa showed the results of the sports festival, and how many offers each student got for the hero work studies. And this time, Izuku got more requests since he showed how powerful, versatile, and unique his quirk or Venom was. But before they were able to choose a hero to intern for, Midnight walked into the room, and she told them that they'll be coming up with hero names. And the name Izuku chose after some time was a symbiotic hero, Venom. And after they came up with hero names, they began to look for an agency to intern for. And after a couple hours of Izuku and Venom deciding on an agency to join, the pair chose the pro hero Gunhead. And the reason they did this is because he is a pro hero that specializes in close quarters combat. And they believe that it would be the most beneficial to learn how to fight better, especially with their super strengths and super fast reflexes. And also because the two were sent an invite. Okay, so now we skip to when the internships were about to begin. And right before Izuku and Ochako went on the train to their internship, the two went over to Ida, who was walking to his train. And they told him that they were his friends, and that he could tell them anything. And hearing this, he nods his head, then he continues to walk away. And after he walked away, the two walked over to their train. Okay, so now we skip to when the two were able to set up the rooms. And when they were done setting up, Gunhead took Izuku and Ochako out for a patrol around the city. And while the three were out on patrol, Gunhead asked the two what their specialties were and what their weaknesses were, so he could figure out how best to train them. And hearing this, Izuku told Gunhead all of his abilities, including all of his basic superhuman abilities. And he told him that his weakness were flames, loud noises, and he could lose control of himself if he's not careful. And hearing this, Gunhead began to think about what he should do for Izuku. And when the two were done explaining their quirks, Gunhead told them what a true hero was, which is a person who does selfless acts, and also have power to back them up. and afterward they're given off the rest of the day so they could get their bearings and get to know the people in the agency. Then the next day when it was morning, their training began, with them practicing proper fighting form. Then after lunch, Gunhead gave Izuku a blindfold and he told him to put it on while he fought Gunhead's sidekicks, so Izuku could practice fighting actual people using what he just learned, and so he can learn to rely on his super senses. And he did that for the rest of the day. Then the next day was Izuku fighting solely with his tendrils, so he could get better at using them, controlling them, and increasing their duration. And with that, Izuku learned that if he truly hones his tendrils, he can control the density of the symbiote, so he can make his hands into weapons. For example, making his hand into a giant blade, but he can only do that for 3 minutes maximum, before he and Venom start to lose steam. But on the bright side, he was able to make it so he can keep up his tendrils for 10 minutes if he sticks with 2. And he also learned that he can make more tendrils, but that lowers the span of time he can keep them up. And this type of training kept going on until the internships were done. But sadly, the day before the internships ended, it was announced that Ida had died in Hosu, presumably because of the hero killer, because his body was found in an alley right next to the pro-hero native who was also dead. And it seemed to have happened during the attack at Hosu, but because of the commotion, it wasn't noticed. And that's what I'm going to leave the What If. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.